Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
And I'm George. Yesterday, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister James Marape announced Australia's support for a PNG team to join the National Rugby League competition from 2028.
Rugby League is PNG's national sport, and PNG deserves a national team.
On the surface, this is a story about expanding one of Australia's most dominant sports in the Asia-Pacific region. But as we heard from the leaders of both nations yesterday, this is a story just as much about politics and tensions in the Pacific, as well as a story about rugby.
It's always so interesting when sport and politics come together. Why don't we start with what we need to know about the diplomatic relationship between Papua New Guinea and Australia?
So PNG is one of Australia's closest neighbours, literally, as in its proximity to the Australian mainland, but also, we have diplomatic ties with PNG stretching way back. So we'll start with the early 1900s. The southern part of PNG at that time was actually a territory of Australia. Germany had control over the northern part. And then in the late 1940s, these territories were combined under Australia's control. And that lasted until PNG was granted independence in 1975. But in more recent times, a really big aspect of the relationship between PNG and Australia is our shared love of rugby league. And that's where my geopolitical analysis is going to pause, because we need your expertise here, George, of course, as TDA's sports journalist.
Well, I love the little history lesson, Emma. Appreciate that.
More where that came from.
And rugby league is obviously a massive part of Australia's sporting landscape, but it's also the national sport of Papua New Guinea. Its national men's team is the Kumuls, which means birds of paradise in one of PNG's national languages, Tok Pisin. The Kumuls have competed in the Rugby League World Cup alongside Australia and New Zealand, and its national women's team is called the Orchids, who play Australia's Gillaroos in the Pacific Championships.
Okay, so how do we get to the stage of Papua New Guinea and Australia holding talks about reshaping the NRL to make space for a PNG team?
Well, as we know, sport is a business and the NRL wants to grow, it wants to get bigger. And this is just part of the NRL's expansion plan. So in 2023, it expanded from 16 to 17 clubs with the inclusion of the Redcliffe Dolphins, who are from Queensland. And then the NRL's expansion to PNG is a more ambitious goal. And it's been in talks for a little while. So during a visit to PNG last year, Federal Minister for the Pacific, Pat Conroy, said the government has an earnest desire to deliver a rugby league team in Papua New Guinea. So Conroy announced a $5.5 million fund to help PNG build its case to join the NRL, to support player pathways to encourage young people's involvement in the game, and the growth of the NRLW as well, which is the women's game.
Yeah. And so as you mentioned, sport being a business, I guess the idea would be then when you've got these player pathways, when you're developing the kind of grassroots contact that young people in PNG might have with the game, that's ultimately going to lead to more success for the NRL as a whole. Now, you mentioned this is a conversation that's been going on for a little while, but I wanted to talk a bit more about the political context that it's been developing alongside. So PNG's PM said last year that rugby league has strengthened the diplomatic ties between PNG and Australia. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has made comments throughout the last year that it's been a discussion point between the two nations, that, PNG is very passionate about their rugby league and it makes sense economically, diplomatically, and that's a position that's been adopted by the coalition as well. Now, that all sounds like healthy diplomacy and friendship between two countries, but there is another more serious layer here, I guess, which centres around China and concerns about its growing influence in the Pacific and territories in the Pacific that are a short distance from the Australian mainland. So, for example, we've got the Solomon Islands, who signed a security deal with China in 2022. Now, that deal included things like an increased presence of Chinese police in Solomon Islands, and Australia very publicly kind of condemned that deal, and it stoked concerns of an increased Chinese presence close to Australia. So since then, we've seen Australia prioritise relations with the Solomons under its own security deal, deploying police to events like the 2023 Pacific Games, this year's election there. And obviously, Solomon is not Papua New Guinea, but that just is one example to give you a sense of where the Australian government is at when it's thinking about its relationships with our Pacific neighbours.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about just a love for rugby league here. There's a little bit of underlying politics where both governments might want to include a team from Papua New Guinea for reasons that expand beyond the sport.
Exactly. And, there are similar concerns about PNG's relationship with China, and this deal is kind of described as part of this broader strategy from the government to secure PNG's loyalty as this kind of tension with China in the South Pacific continues. It's a deal that, may have impacts or geopolitical benefits that expand really far beyond the realms of the sporting world. So after months of it seeming like this deal, George, was getting closer to becoming a reality, we had that diplomatic visit last year, the funding announcement, more talk, more development this year. But those plans came to life yesterday, right? And we got some firm details.
Exactly. So Albanese and Marape held a press conference yesterday to announce a deal for the Pacific nation to join the NRL in 2028. Both leaders talked about the economic benefit of introducing a PNG team. It's the most populous nation in the Pacific behind Australia, and much of the country is in poverty. So there's some motivation there to give the country some economic benefit.
So what has the Australian government actually promised? What are the bones of this deal?
The core part of the announcement is a $600 million allocation over a 10-year period, which is a lot of money. The PNG government announced two major components to their end of the deal: a pledge to build accommodation and facilities for the new team and its players, and all salaries to be tax-free, which may make a move to PNG to join the team more appealing to star players currently with Australian or New Zealand teams.
That's very interesting, because I was wondering, is the angle going to be that the national team from PNG in the NRL is, focused on PNG players, or will we see a bit of wheeling and dealing here across the league?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
I think I've heard talks that they're going to try and build an all-star team, and the NRL wants to make PNG as attractive as possible for star players to relocate from established lives to another country and start again there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not all talk of growth, sport and economic prosperity. Other media have reported that there's a clause that allows the Aussie government to withdraw from the deal without reason at any time until 2035.
Now, this clause actually loops back to what we were talking about earlier because of that kind of wider security context at play here. Australia does have a bilateral security agreement with PNG, and that's something widely seen as being designed to protect Australia from Chinese interference.
Exactly. And in fact, as part of the NRL deal, PNG and Australia reportedly signed a separate agreement called a strategic trust. The details of that agreement will remain confidential, but experts believe it involves further guarantees from PNG that it will not form closer bonds with China. So it looks like Australia's ability to withdraw from the deal at any time could be related to China's presence there.
Wow, so there really will be a lot at stake for PNG to kind of manage its diplomatic ties with both China and Australia. Nothing like a bit of sport diplomacy, George.
Yeah, it's amazing. Sport is one of the most powerful diplomatic tools, and we've seen it time and time again. In almost every part of the world, you can find examples of sport being used as a political tool. In the 1980s, the President of Pakistan went to India to watch a test cricket match between the two nations. It was called cricket diplomacy or cricket for peace. Mm-hmm. We saw a similar thing in 1995 at the Rugby World Cup, where Nelson Mandela brought the nation together, and the rugby team brought the nation together. You may have seen Invictus starring Matt Damon.
Say, the famous rugby union player Matt Damon.
Or take Saudi Arabia, who yesterday were announced as the hosts of the 2034 FIFA World Cup. They're trying to use the FIFA World Cup and soccer as a form of diplomacy to improve their world standing. Some are accusing them of sports washing.
So that's this idea of Saudi Arabian authorities buying up teams, hosting events, trying to improve their standing in English-speaking countries, boost tourism by bringing more kind of big ticket stadium sporting moments to the country.
Exactly. And of course, sport can be used as a political tool in the other direction. I'm thinking of examples like banning Russian athletes from competing under their national flag at the Olympics or in tennis events after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So it's using kind of a political climate or global contexts through sport to send a message.
Yeah, and sport is a platform where there are a lot of eyeballs, people are watching it, so it can be a place to make a really political statement.
Okay, so clearly this is a really nuanced and layered story, a lot more to it than, the headlines might indicate an NRL expansion story on its own. What happens from here, George? What are the next steps?
Well, there's also discussions for a Perth team to join the NRL in 2027. And the code has said that it wants 20 teams by the 2032 Olympics in Brisbane. So we'd expect to see a PNG NRL team in 2028 either as the 18th or the 19th team to join the competition. And that really depends on the progression of the Perth team.
Fascinating. And much to the disappointment of my mum, the North Sydney Bears not making a comeback.
No, they won't be the Bears, unfortunately.
George, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for talking us through that. It's not every day I get an opportunity to kind of chat geopolitics with the sports journalist.
Well, it's my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
If you want to hear more from George and get his take on all the big sporting moments in the world, don't forget to sign up to our sports newsletter. It hits your inbox at 5 p.m. every weekday. It's free to sign up. We will pop a link in the bio. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. We will be back later on this evening with the afternoon headlines. But until then, have a great day.